Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on display devices. Now, when we talk about display devices, it's very difficult not to also talk about the term monitors, okay? Because a monitor is, well, the primary form of display device. All right, so I'd like to do here is kind of go through an overview of monitors and what some of the terminology is and how they work. So first of all, a monitor is the primary output device for a computer. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about various input devices on a computer, right? You have things like keyboards and mice. Those are input devices, all right, because we perform actions and it sends a signal into the computer telling it to do something. Whereas the monitor is the computer now trying to communicate back to us, the human. Okay, and so it displays things out on the monitor. Now, in order to use a monitor, it requires a video card, which is also sometimes referred to as a video adapter, video controller, graphics adapter. And this is something that we actually talked about in the expansion cards lesson. Now, there's some terminology that I'd like to go over with you. First one is something called the viewing size. And the viewing size, which is also sometimes referred to as the display area, refers to the dimensions of viewable screen. Okay, so when you're looking at a monitor, right, you look at the actual device itself, whether it be one, which is, an older one like what you see on the screen right now, or maybe the monitor you're actually looking at to see this particular lesson. The monitor as a whole is one size, but only part of it has actual viewable area. Okay, and that's the display area. Now, in order to figure out how to measure the viewing size or this display area, use a diagonal measurement. And this is true for any and all forms of monitors, or quite frankly, televisions as well. And I will tell you that really there's not much difference between a monitor and a television. Okay, I mean, really the big difference is that a television will have a tuner built into it. Okay, so that it can receive a broadcast. But as far as the display aspect of it, they're pretty much the same device. Okay, so when you take the diagonal measurement, and it doesn't matter if you go from the bottom left to the top right or from the top left down to the bottom right, if you were to measure that with a straight line, you'll get your viewing size. And so when you see that a monitor is a 19-inch monitor, that means that if you were to measure from corner to corner in a straight line diagonally, it'd be 19 inches. Now, the next term that I'd like to go over with you is something called the aspect ratio. Okay, now this is simply the ratio of the width of the image against the height of the image. Now, our standard definition ratios, okay, so if we go back, before we had high def, right, when we had what we used to call like square TVs and square monitors, they weren't actually square, believe it or not. Okay, their aspect ratio was 4:3. Okay, so it was a 4:3 aspect ratio, and this is again our old standard definition regular TV broadcast. So what this means is if you were to measure the viewing area and you measure how far it is across and you compare it to how far it is top to bottom, you'll notice that you end up with a 4:3 ratio. Okay, now this will become a little bit more apparent when we talk about something called resolution. Okay, and one resolution that was fairly common that I think makes the 4:3 ratio easy to understand and easy to calculate, even if you're not that good with math, is if you ever hear the resolution 800 by 600. Now we'll talk about what those numbers actually mean, but it has to do with the number of pixels, and if you just say that there's 800 pixels across by 600 down, well, if you were to, you turn that into a fraction, right? You say, let's say it was 800 over 600, and you divide that down, you'd end up with 4/3. Okay, so you end up with the 4:3 ratio. I hope I didn't confuse you worse by throwing that out there. But I will tell you that with high def, the high definition ratio is now 16:9. Okay, or some say 16:9. Regardless of how you say it, as far as 16:9, it's the same horizontal against vertical. You'll notice that 16:9 is greater than 4:3 as far as the width goes, right? It's wider, and that's why we sometimes call it widescreen. Okay, because 4 by 3 would be 12 by 9. Okay, so now that we're saying 16 by 9, it means that it's going to be a wider screen. But we still measure the display area or the viewing size diagonally, even if we're talking about a 16 by 9. Okay, so here is an example of what I'm talking about as far as 4 by 3 versus 16 by 9. And the layman's terms for a 4 by 3 is a square screen. It's not literally square because it's not 3 by 3, it's 4 by 3, but it looks kind of square. And then the 16 by 9 very often is referred to simply as widescreen. And again, sometimes they'll call it an HD screen instead of widescreen versus standard screen or square screen. Now, speaking of resolution, right? I just mentioned that term a moment ago. Resolution is the measurement of the number of pixels in each dimension that can be used to display a picture. Okay, and this is sometimes referred to as the pixel dimensions. An example would be 640 by 480, or as I mentioned a moment ago, 800 by 600 or 1024 by 768. Now, these are your standard definition resolutions, okay, that I threw out there. So those are older standard resolutions that we don't see as much anymore. Now we would see something more along the lines of 1920 by 1080. That'd be full high def. Or 1280 by 720. Or 1600 by 900. Okay, these are some of the resolutions that we see on our high def or widescreen monitors. Now, some manufacturers will quote the input formats that a monitor can accept, not the actual, what's known as native resolution that the screen can actually present. But I just want to point out that from an advertisement standpoint, right, when you go to buy a monitor, they'll say maximum resolution. And sometimes it'll have to do with the input format. So here's an example of what I'm talking about, is the input signal that a monitor may be able to accept might be 1920 by 1080, right? That makes a monitor sound like it can do much better if we say, hey, it can do 1920 by 1080, which is also, by the way, known in the television world, if you have that resolution, as being full 1080p, right? So if you have that full 1920 by 1080 input signal, but the reality is that the monitor itself can only handle 1366 by 768. In other words, it only has 1366 pixels across by 768 pixels down. Okay, so the native resolution is the physical grid size of the monitor itself, that viewing area of the monitor. Any resolution that comes in, right, if you can accept a signal larger than that native resolution, then it has to be resized down to that native resolution. Okay, so that's what's actually happening is it's taking a higher signal in, and then it's reproducing the image, and it's scaling it down to the native resolution that the monitor can actually handle. Now here again are some of the common monitor resolutions. I mentioned a bunch of them, right? Like 640 by 480, 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, and I actually go up from there. Some of the high def ones, I mentioned 1600 by 900, 1920 by 1080. There is 1366 by 768. Now, one that I mentioned that you don't see here is the 1280 by 720, and that is something you see on televisions a lot, but you don't necessarily see that quite as often on computer monitors. Now, I should point out that there's another term that I've been using here that we're going to clarify in just a few moments. I keep using the term pixel, and you might be wondering what a pixel is. Okay, so I will clarify that for you. But for right now, we're going to simplify it, and we're going to say dots. Right? We're going to say dots across the screen. Now, that's actually not technically accurate statement, but just so you can picture it, picture if you were drawing a picture with dots. When we say that something is 800 by 600, it means there's 800 dots across by 600 dots down. Okay, just for simplicity, but we'll clarify that in just a few minutes. But before we get there, another term that I'd like to go over with you is something called the refresh rate. And the refresh rate has to do with the number of times per second that the monitor will update the image on the screen. Now, how it updates this image and what we mean by that is going to vary based upon the monitor technology that you're using, and we'll talk about a couple of different monitor technologies here in a moment. Okay, but understand that when you are looking at a monitor, even right now while you're looking at this, when you think you're looking at an image and it's just statically on the screen. It's actually not. Okay? Regardless of the technology that is used, an image can only be displayed on the screen for a very short amount of time without having to be refreshed. So what you're actually looking at is an image that is being very, very quickly and very repetitively refreshed again and again and again and again and again before your very eyes. And that's the reason why, by the way, and you don't see this as much anymore with the newer technologies, but if you ever took, on an older monitor, if you ever took a video camera, or sometimes you might even have noticed this on television, maybe during a news broadcast, where you see a monitor or a television in the background, and it seems as though it's flickering a lot, and maybe even scrolling a little bit. And the reason why is because the human eye does not realize that it's being refreshed, because it's being refreshed so quickly that we just see it as a static image. But some of the higher tech video cameras can actually catch that happening, and then depending on, once you've recorded it and then how that recording is rendered and displayed back to you, you might actually see these refreshes. Now the refresh rate is measured in hertz, okay? Hz, that is the term, hertz. And so if our monitor is set, let's say, to a 60 hertz refresh rate, that means that 60 times per second the screen is being refreshed. Okay, that's how many times per second. So you can imagine, how many times a minute, right? It'd be 60 per second times 60 seconds. That's 3,600 times every minute the screen has to be refreshed. So if you stare at the monitor right now and it doesn't change for the next minute and it's set to 60 hertz, you can know that in the background the screen has actually displayed itself to you 3,600 times. Now another term we have here is something called contrast ratio, and this is the ratio of the brightest white versus the darkest black that the monitor can produce. Okay, and so for what should seem obvious, a higher contrast ratio is considered desirable. Okay, because the whiter a white versus the blacker a black, that's the bigger range you're going to get. And so that's how, the colors that you produce in between are going to be that much clearer and much more well defined when we have a larger contrast ratio. Now monitors have something called phosphors, and these are the actual dots, believe it or not. Okay, you remember how I said pixels, you can just think of them as dots? Technically, they're not dots. The phosphors are the dots. They are the red, green, and blue elements. All right, you might have heard of RGB. That stands for red, green, blue. Okay, those are the elements that are used to actually create all the other colors that we see on our monitors. The phosphors glow when they are exposed to electrons, and I will tell you, if we want to be super technically accurate here, I'm almost jumping the gun a little bit here, and I'm talking about a specific type of monitor. Okay, so not all monitors use the literal phosphors, but I think this is the easiest way to explain how certain things like pixels and dot pitch and other terms actually work. Okay, so phosphors glow when they are exposed to electrons, right? They're red, green, and blue, and they glow. Pixels are not dots. They are actually any combination of adjacent red, green, and blue phosphors. Now, the best way to explain how this works is to show you, a typical monitor and how the red, green, and blue would be organized. So you'll see we have the red, green, and blue, and there's a pattern to it. And a pixel will then be any three adjacent. So here's the deal. In the circle that I have pulled out, right, the yellowish circle that I have pulled out, how many pixels do you think we have there? Okay, so I've done this before, and I've had a lot of people guess 2 and then the beginning of another one. Some people might say 3, but the reality is that I have 1 pixel drawn out for you right now, but here's a second, here's a third, here's a fourth, here's a fifth. Okay, there's actually 5 pixels in this specific group of phosphors. Okay, so the pixels actually overlap, technically. Okay, so this would be 5 pixels. Again, the part that I've drawn out here in the yellow circle. Now, dot pitch, this is another term you need to be familiar with. This has to do with the distance between two adjacent phosphors of the same color. So I have illustrated down below the line between from red to red, or between green to green, or between blue to blue. That's the distance that you want to measure to come up with the dot pitch. It's usually measured in really small amounts, like millimeters. And obviously, the smaller the number, the better. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to resolution, and we talk about pixel measurement, obviously, the more pixels that we can fit into the monitor, the sharper we could make an image, right? If you think of, and I talk about this in other lessons as well, but you talk about images, even some famous paintings that were created, and they were created just with a bunch of dots. If you get enough of them put together, you don't recognize that there's dots anymore. It just looks like an image. It looks like a drawing. It looks like a painting. So along those same lines, the tighter together those dots are, the better off we are. Okay, so just picture if you drew me a picture on a piece of paper and you were only allowed to make dots to draw that picture. The more dots you use, the clearer the image is going to be, and the closer together the dots are, the clearer the image will be. All right, so that's how I want you to think about it. Now, there are two primary types of monitors, and they are CRT and LCD. CRT stands for cathode ray tubes, and LCD stands for liquid crystal display. And we're going to talk about both of these in just a moment, but before we do, there are some other monitor types, and I'm bringing these up because they're actually specifically listed on the CompTIA objectives. But the reality is you're not going to see them used in the world of computing, and in some cases here, they're not even technically a type of monitor. So the first type I have listed here is something called a plasma. Now, a plasma monitor, or what's sometimes called a plasma display panel, or a PDP, this is a popular technology for displaying movies. So you see there's a lot of plasma televisions out there, but you don't see a lot of plasma monitors out there. Even though it does compete directly with LCD screens for the flat panel type monitors, that's the one advantage to plasma is they are flat screen like LCD. They also offer a wider viewing angle. If you have a plasma television at home or you know someone that has one, you'll notice you can stand almost completely on the side and still see the image and see it pretty clearly. They also tend to cost less. Now, the negatives are they weigh a lot more and they consume a lot more electricity. Okay, so that's one reason why we don't see them a lot. But really, there are two other major reasons that we don't use plasma monitors. One, and this is the big one, is plasma suffers from something called burn-in. Okay, and this is something we used to have to deal with even with our old CRT monitors. Okay, and this is the idea where if an image has been refreshed enough times consistently, just sitting up on a screen, even once that image is told to go away, even if you turn off the monitor altogether, there can be a ghost of that image that is left lingering on the screen. So this is why we don't use it on computer monitors, because when it comes to computer monitors, you do have images that will stay up on the screen for very long periods of time. It's why we used to have something called screensavers, which is where if someone walked away from a monitor, if it had the same thing up on the screen and there was no movement for a certain period of time, it would either blank out or it would at least go to something that was constantly moving around the screen so that it wouldn't just get burnt in. Now, another type of monitor that CompTIA lists in their objectives is an LED monitor. But here's the deal. Technically, there is no such thing as an LED monitor. Likewise, there's also no such thing as an LED television. You might be thinking to yourself, whoa, wait a minute. I own one. I own an LED television. Well, you only kind of own an LED television. Technically, an LED monitor or television is an LCD. It's a liquid crystal display that uses LED for its backlight. Okay, so LCD monitors have to be backlit. And although they traditionally, if it's just an LCD monitor, use a fluorescent lamp as the backlight, it's technically called a CCFL, a cold cathode fluorescent lamp. Newer LCD monitors have LED lit backlights. Okay, so the reason they do that is because you do tend to get brighter, crisper light, and it's definitely more energy efficient. Okay, LED is more energy efficient than fluorescent lighting. Now, the one other type of display device that is mentioned in the objectives is an OLED. Now, OLED stands for organic LED. And by the way, LED stands for light emitting diode. Yeah, that's what it stands for. But OLED is organic light emitting diode. And this is the idea where there's an organic compound which will provide the light for the screen. Basically, applying electric current causes the organic layer to glow in certain precise spots that are desired. Now, that's about all I'm going to tell you about it at this point, because you won't even find OLED in your typical computer monitors. You won't even find it really in your laptop monitors, even though CompTIA does list it there as well. You'll find it, if anywhere, in some of your higher-end smartphones. Okay, it is a very expensive technology. Okay, so you're going to find it in the much smaller monitors, not the larger monitors that you'd use for a computer. Now, there is one other thing that I just thought of when I was talking about plasma, and I was talking about how the viewing angle, how you can look you can go all the way on the side and view it. Well, a couple things to keep in mind with the various displays, CRT, LCD, plasma, whatever it might be, and that is that there are different screen surfaces. Some are more glossy than others, right? Some are pure glass, like they have like a glass screen, and other ones have a more matted screen. And so, you're going to get more of a glare on a more glossy screen. Okay, so you might want to use like an anti-glare filter that you can put over the monitor. And then also you have the angle, not just that light will reflect and cause a glare, but what about privacy? As far as people being able to look over your shoulder or stand somewhere maybe far away but off to the side and you don't think they can see your monitor, but they actually can. So they also sell privacy filters, which are special filters you throw on top which take away that angle, and you can only look straight on at the monitor. So just a couple of things I just kind of thought of we should talk about. All right, let's talk about CRT, cathode ray tubes. Let's talk about how it works. It's a vacuum tube which contains, right, it's this big old vacuum tube that contains an electron gun, a fluorescent screen, some magnets, something called a shadow mask, which we'll look at in just a bit here. And we've had cathode ray tubes or CRTs going way back in our older standard definition televisions, and then of course it was also in our original computer monitors. Now, the actual functionality, how does this work? The idea is you have this electron gun which will shine an electron beam, okay, and you have one for each color, red, green, and blue. We then have magnets which bend the beams to illuminate specific areas of the screen. Now, when these electron beams are shot out and the magnets bend the beams to illuminate the screen, we have something called scanning. In other words, this happens, remember we talked about refresh rate? Okay, so we have this scanning which is horizontal from left to right and then from top to bottom. It's this scanning that happens several times per second, and that's how we get our refresh. Now, the shadow mask, which I mentioned, it's just what it sounds like. It's a mask. It's this extra mat that is actually behind the glass, which will block the beams from hitting unused area of the screen. So the shadow mask, you picture it as like this big black mat that has a bunch of pinholes in it to allow these electron beams to come through and then show up on the screen. Now, here's an illustration of it, right? So again, we have our electron gun with our red, green, and blue. It shoots those beams. You then have a magnet which will then deflect those beams to a specific area of the screen. And then you have this scan, which again, it's these lines going across one at a time and then working their way down the screen, and then you go back up to the top when you get to the bottom. And the shadow mask is just this black film that's behind the glass. And I will also tell you, by the way, this isn't going to do you a lot of good in today's world because we don't really use CRT televisions anymore. But back in the day, when you'd go into a television store, right, you go into some kind of appliance store where you buy TVs, and we still have this today where you have all the TVs, right? They're all on, they're all viewing the same channel, and we're seeing the same image, and you want to see which one looks the best. Well, you know what was a really neat trick to do if you really wanted to know which television was going to produce the sharpest, clearest crispest picture with the nicest, sharpest colors. You would go ask the store manager, and the store manager would hate you for doing this, but you'd go ask them to turn off all the televisions. And you say, huh? Why am I turning off all the TVs? Well, what you want to look for is which one actually was the darkest black when the television was off. And that would tell you which had the most true black shadow mask relative to the others. In other words, that's why when you turn a TV off and you look through the glass, you just see black. That's why. You're looking at the shadow mask. And whichever one had the blackest black usually is going to produce the best image. Okay, so a neat little trick that won't do you any good in today's world. Thanks, Ed. So here again is just a further illustration of how we have the front glass and then you have that shadow mask behind it, and poking through the shadow mask are the actual phosphors, which are then illuminated by the electrons being shot off by the electron gun and being deflected by the magnets. Now, there is a term when it comes to CRTs that you should be familiar with, and it's something called degaussing. I think I've also heard some people call it degaussing. I don't know which way you do it. I always said degaussing. Anyway, this is the process of decreasing or eliminating unwanted magnetic field. Okay, so why do we want to do that? Well, since our CRTs use magnetic fields to send the electron beams to the correct locations, if there are any other external magnets that are nearby, it can affect where those electron beams are going, and you'll get a distorted image. Okay, so I'll never forget the day that a neighbor of mine called me over to his house because he was all freaked out that his daughter had just destroyed his television. And the reason why he thought she had destroyed the television is, well, she had taken a bunch of magnets and put them up on the television, and they were sitting there, and she had drawn pictures with them and whatever, and he couldn't get those images, those weird images, to go away. Well, all I did was I went up to his television and noticed that it had a button that said degauss. Right? That's that button that you'd hit sometimes in the older days on the older CRT monitors, and the monitor would be like, boom, you'd hear that little sound, and the whole image would distort for a moment, but then everything would clear up. Well, that's what it was doing. It was eliminating all that extra magnetic energy and put everything back to the way it was supposed to be. So some televisions or monitors have that internal built-in degausser, but others you might have to use something called an external degausser. Now, I've actually even seen where somebody has manually had a large enough magnet that they could almost basically sweep straight down and across the monitor to try to basically magnetically just clean up everything. I don't recommend that you do it, but that is something that I have seen done. Now, I need to throw something out here. I know it's not the lesson where we're talking about this. We'll revisit this in a later lesson. But CRTs are very dangerous. So please keep in mind that the phosphors are toxic. If the glass breaks, do not touch the glass or anything else with your bare hands. Make sure that you're using safety gloves, goggles, and be very, very careful. This stuff is very toxic and very dangerous. Another issue is that a CRT is under extremely high voltage. You should not be attempting to repair a defective CRT on your own. Leave that up to a skilled, certified professional. The components inside are not known as what's called FRUs, field replaceable units. You either send it into a repair center or you throw it out and you get a new monitor. All right, so that's CRTs. The other main type of monitor is an LCD, a liquid crystal display. This is what we see way more often in today's computers. Some of the benefits. They're safer to operate than the CRT, so the materials are actually safer, not as toxic. They take up less space on the desktop. That's actually probably the number one reason why we started using them, right? These big, bulky, CRT monitors, we needed to find something better. They're lighter. They take up less space. They're also lighter, easier to carry around, and they're much more power efficient. So the bottom line is LCDs rule. So now the technology itself. You have something called thin film transistors, TFT, which uses thin layers of materials to construct the monitor screen. Okay, so this is why we have much thinner monitors than the CRTs, where we had this big tube and we had to actually have all that area so we could shoot the rays and have them deflected. Well, we don't have that anymore with LCD. We now have something called an active matrix technology, which is where each pixel has a separate transistor. The transistor holds the electrical state of the pixel. It only needs a small control charge, which then allows for a faster refresh of the display. And in the end, you end up with an improved image quality, brighter, sharper, and more stable. Now, when we talk about faster refresh of the display, that's also why most LCDs, if you take that same scenario I mapped out for you just a little while ago, where you record it with a video camera and then play it back, you still typically do not see that flickering or that refresh like you did on the old CRTs. So here's an image of and this is a fairly common image. You can find an image like this all over the internet when you look up what LCD layout actually looks like. I'm not going to go into all the inner working details because, quite frankly, you're not going to be, unless you want to specialize in this and you go take special classes for it, you're not going to be tearing apart an LCD and going through these different layers and trying to repair them. But you can see it's all these little thin layers all put together, okay, where you have your matrix, right, your horizontal and your vertical command line. You have your glass plate. You have a front and rear electrodes. You have some spacers. You have your RGB color mask. And you smash them all together, you end up with this nice, thin display. Now, there is one other type of display device that is listed on the CompTIA objectives, and this is something that is used with computers all the time, and that is something called a projector. Right? So instead of an actual monitor, very often we will go ahead and project the image out onto a screen or a wall. Okay? Very often we'll see this used in presentation. So if I were teaching to you in a classroom right now, there'd be a really good chance that what you're seeing on the screen would actually be projected out onto a larger screen so that a bigger audience could see it. We have various projector technologies like LCD, DLP, LED. Okay, so similar to the monitor, the actual lighting mechanism is there's all these different technologies built in, but LCD is still the primary technology that is used. Some of the projector specifications that you should be familiar with are the lumens, which measures the power of a light source as perceived by the human eye. ANSI lumens is the average power of a light source when measured at different positions. The higher the lumens, the brighter the picture. Okay, so brightness is the other way of thinking of lumens. Right? That's the more common term that you hear is the brightness. Right? Usually when you look at a projector, and this is actually true even if you look at many monitors, is you can adjust the brightness. We also have another term called throw, and the throw is the distance between the projector and the screen. The image size will typically increase as the throw increases. Projectors have minimum and maximum recommended throw distances, okay, and this has to do with how close you can put the projector to the screen and how far away you could move the projector from the screen and still have an acceptable viewable image. Now, I will tell you that there is another type of projection technology that's not necessarily the way you're seeing it here, right? This is an example, like I would say, like in the classroom, right, where you have a projector and it's shooting the image out onto a screen and then everyone can see the screen. You also have projection monitors and projection televisions. Okay, I mentioned DLP. Okay, that's a technology where basically the projector sits behind the screen and it projects out onto a screen, and then you're sitting on the other side actually watching the television. Okay, and this is actually a great way, if you're interested, in inexpensively getting a very large television. Okay, you'll see advertisements, you'll see, 80-inch TV for $499. You're thinking, wow, I want to get that my 80-inch TV. Well, the reason you can get that really large television for such a low price is because it's using a projector that is equipped to have a large enough throw along with bright enough lumens to be able to go ahead and get an HD quality image that you can view. Okay, so, and I will tell you, I know some people, I have some friends. One person that I'm thinking of right now, I was just at his house. I want to say his television was a 75-inch. and he paid less than I paid for my 50-inch. Okay, my 50-inch plasma, I paid more than he paid for his 75-inch projection TV. Okay, so that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, this is something that is also talked about in another lesson, but let's make sure we cover them here, is all the different monitor connectors. Okay, and I have I think the majority of them listed here as far as DVI, VGA, composite, and our component, HDMI, and S-Video. Here is an illustration that I think might help you out a little bit more as far as seeing what the connector actually looks like, from the back side. This is what it would look like on the back of the computer if you were trying to plug in any of these particular connectors. Okay, so up at the top we have our VGA, right? Our original, analog, typically used with our standard definition stuff, our 4x3 monitors. Not always though. I mean, you still use VGA even on your widescreen monitors. Okay, but that's your analog signal. Whereas your digital signal is going to be like your HDMI for your true high def and your DVI. Okay, so those are the ones you see most often. S-Video, composite, and component do exist, but typically the three main ones are going to be VGA up at the top, and then HDMI and DVI I've listed at the bottom. Now, one last thing I want to talk to you about, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap up this lesson, is the idea that you don't have to use, necessarily, a single monitor to display your computer. Okay, you can use multiple monitors. Some video cards you will find have connections for multiple monitors. I have one illustrated on the screen right now where you'll see there's the two DVI connectors there. Looks like there might also be an S-Video in the middle, but we'll focus on the two DVIs that are there. And sometimes it'll be just like what is on the screen there, where you have dual DVI connectors. You might have multiple HDMI connectors, multiple VGA connectors, or sometimes you'll see a variety where you'll see different technologies. One DVI, one HDMI, one VGA, one DVI. I think the card I have in the computer I'm using right now has one VGA and one DVI. I could be wrong. No, actually, I'm looking right now. Two computers here in front of me right now, and one of them is exactly what I just described, where I have a video card that allows me to hook up one VGA device and one DVI. And then I have another computer here that actually has dual DVI connectors. Okay, so you have many different options. Now, speaking of options, each monitor is independent. Even though it may be one video card, it's like having two video cards, okay? In the sense that each monitor is going to have its own independent configuration settings, its own resolution, refresh rate, color settings, orientation, everything. You also have the ability to do different things with the monitors. You can duplicate the display so that what appears on one also appears on the other. And this is very often done with a projector. Okay, so very often you'll have a projector. So again, if I was teaching you in the classroom, I would be in front of a monitor for my computer, and what I see on my monitor is also up on the screen. Or when I present, sometimes I will present out at conferences. Same thing, I'll have a monitor in front of me which has the identical image as what's being projected behind me. Another example would be if you have a laptop and then you plug in an external monitor. Sometimes you don't want to use both, you just want what appears on the laptop to also appear up on the big monitor so you can see it better, so you get the duplicate display. Another option you have is to extend the display, or the official terminology in Windows would be extend the desktop. And this is the idea where you use the monitors together to create one larger image. And if you move the cursor off the edge of one monitor, it'll move on to the edge of the other monitor. And by the way, I have displayed here two monitors, but the reality is that you could use more than two. I'm sure, especially in today's world, you've probably been somewhere where you've seen images that were displayed through many monitors all put together. Okay? So that's just something to keep in mind, is that you can have multiple monitors. Now, this is what it looks like in the Windows operating system, where you have the choice of either duplicate these displays, extend these displays. Now, you have the ability to also only use one monitor or the other. Okay, so that's why, just to explain what you're looking at here with the drop-down box, but you have the two main choices of extending or duplicating these displays. Now, besides being able to duplicate or extend the displays, you'll also notice that each monitor, you have the choice of a resolution and an orientation, and there are other advanced settings. Matter of fact, here, if we click on that, we have other advanced settings that we can also do specifically for each individual monitor. And so that does bring us to the end of this lesson on display devices, where we learned all sorts of different monitor terminologies. Okay, so there's a lot of terminology, a lot of technologies. Two main monitor types. We have CRT and LCD. A third main type would be projectors. We talked about them as well. Remember that in the objectives, they also refer to plasma, which is a technology that exists, but primarily for televisions, not for computer monitors. And they also list LED, which is not an actual type of monitor, but a type of backlight that is used, and OLED, which is also a type of backlight, but it's not even found in computer monitors at all. You'll find it in your smartphone monitors. So that is pretty much it. I know that was a long lesson. Displays, they're actually a very cool thing. The technology and how it works is very cool. And I will also tell you, if you are going to truly want to work on displays, right? You want to actually be a repair technician, you will want to take a much more advanced class on how things like CRTs and LCDs actually work. And with that, I thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.